Okay, so we're live. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today for what is our first webinar in our series. So my name is Rachel Powell, and I know most of you here on the call, but I'm the Women's Sector Lobbyist with the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and I'm also the chair of the Women's Policy Group Northern Ireland. So back in July, we launched our comprehensive 127-page long COVID feminist recovery plan for Northern Ireland. And for those who aren't familiar with the plan, it's split up into a number of different pillars. So there's economic justice, which is our biggest pillar, health, social justice, culture, human rights, and then an international comparison of what's going on outside of Northern Ireland. And this webinar today will explore an aspect of the economic justice pillar through discussions on the impact COVID-19 has had on women, specifically by looking at poverty, austerity, debt, and universal credit. So we have an excellent lineup of speakers today. We have Siobhan Harding from the Women's Support Network, who is also a member of the Women's Policy Group and contributed significantly to the Feminist Recovery Plan. And she's a member of the Cliff Edge Coalition. We also have Kerry Logan from Housing Rights and member of the Cliff Edge Coalition. And finally, we have Rachel Jeffers from the Law Centre Northern Ireland, who are also members of the Cliff Edge Coalition. So our speakers today will be covering some of the recommendations from the Feminist Recovery Plan in relation to poverty, austerity, and women. They will also be presenting some new evidence on the impact universal credit has had on women, specifically in Northern Ireland. There will be discussions of the new aims of the Cliff Edge Coalition campaign. For those who aren't aware, Cliff Edge Coalition is a campaign about welfare reform and the mitigation packages that were running out after austerity was brought in Northern Ireland. So we will have a bit of an overview of the future of that campaign. And then we will have some case studies from the Law Centre Northern Ireland on how aspects of our welfare system have disproportionately impacted women in Northern Ireland. This will then be followed with a short question and answer. So again, could you please put your questions into the chat box? And if you want, either I can ask the speakers the question or you can raise your hand and ask yourself. So today's session is just the first in a series that we will be doing until at least February 21. And some of the upcoming sessions that we have after today include a session next Thursday with the Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network on World Rural Women's Day, looking at the impact on women who live in rural areas specifically. And then on the 22nd of October, we're going to be doing an event where we're doing a global outlook. We'll have speakers from South Africa, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, and Northern Ireland. Then we will be having an event on Wednesday, the 11th of November, looking at additional health impacts from COVID. So we will be hearing from WRDA and covering issues like perinatal mental health, the impact of all the missed cancer screenings. Then we'll be listening to Transgender NI about the specific health impacts for trans women. From Alliance for Choice about the ongoing prevention of any abortion provision in Northern Ireland. Migrant Centre NI on hostile environments for Black and racialised people. And we will also be listening to Disabled Women Ireland. And then finally, we'll have an event on the 26th of November, looking specifically at violence against women with Raise Your Voice, Women's Aid and Amnesty International. So that's just the beginning of what we have between now and the end of November. So I just wanted to give an overview and I'll send that into the chat as well so you can register for the other events. But before I introduce our first speaker, I want to provide a bit of context about how the Feminist Recovery Plan came about and how we decided on our specific recommendations to alleviate the disproportionate impact of poverty and austerity on women. So I do know that Siobhan is likely going to go into this in much more detail after me, but following the financial crash in the UK, we saw that women were by far the worst hit by the austerity measures that were brought in. So much so that the UN Special Rapporteur, Philip Alston, who was in Northern Ireland in December last year, described the austerity package as one of the most misogynistic policies he had ever seen. We know as well that in that decade following the crash, 86% of tax revenue savings through austerity came from women. So austerity was a choice and it does not need to happen again. And we need to be having these conversations to ensure that the response to the crash from COVID is not going to be dealt with through austerity. But when we look at COVID-19 specifically, the impact on women is severe. In Northern Ireland, we know that over 70% of health and social care workers are women. We also know that women are 85% of part-time workers, 70% of workers ineligible for statutory sick pay, and also that women carry out the majority of retail, hospitality, and unpaid care work. Women also are in low-paid precarious work situations and cannot access childcare. And in our recovery programme from the government, when they talked about reopening the economy, they did not mention women, they did not mention childcare, and they did not mention any of these issues. So it's clear that we need to keep showing the evidence of why we need a gendered response. Women have been left out of the decision-making process. Policymakers have been taking an approach in Northern Ireland where cuts are to everyone. So for example, a cut to welfare reform, well, everyone who's on welfare reform will receive that cut. Therefore, we don't need to consider women. And we really need to call that out, because that is just showing complete ignorance to the fact that women access public services much more than men and are disproportionately impacted by these cuts. So it is really not good enough, and we're hoping that through the campaign on the Feminist Recovery Plan over the next year, that we will be calling for gender budgeting and the specific impact on women to be taken into consideration in the response to COVID and all future programme for governments. So that's it for me initially about the gendered impact of poverty and how we got to where we are. To kick us off, we have Siobhan Harding, who is from the Women's Support Network, and will discuss some of the recommendations in the Feminist Recovery Plan, alongside her recent research that was just launched a number of weeks ago on the impact of universal credit on women. Thank you, Siobhan.
All right, thanks very much, Rachel, and thanks for organising this event today, and to you all for coming along. I'm very proud to have worked on the Feminist Recovery Plan alongside Rachel and a number of other women. As you know, it's a comprehensive plan, as Rachel has said, on the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls in Northern Ireland across a number of pillars, and the one that we're focusing on today is the economic justice pillar. So based on the evidence in the plan, a series of recommendations were made, and I'm going to talk about these first before I then talk a bit about the Women's Regional Consortium research, which has just been published on universal credit and women. The backdrop to the pandemic is that women have already suffered as a result of a decade of austerity and welfare reform policies following the 2008 financial crash. And as Rachel said, the research shows that 86% of the savings to the Treasury from all of those austerity and welfare reform changes will have come from women. So women are more likely to be impacted by austerity and welfare reform measures because of their concentration in low paid and part-time and insecure work, but also because they're more likely to be caring for children and other family members, and also more likely to have to make up for cuts to services through unpaid work. So women were already in a vulnerable and precarious economic position even before the pandemic hit. And the situation is likely to worsen, as Rachel touched on there at the start, because women bear the brunt of unpaid caring responsibilities, both for children and for other family members, and also more likely to suffer job losses because they're concentrated in sectors which are most hit and most likely to be shut down, including retail, hospitality and travel. As the UN director, the executive director of UN Women said, there is no gender neutral pandemic, and this one is no different. Research by the Institute for Social and Economic Research has shown that single mothers and the lowest paid are hardest hit by the loss of income as a result of the virus. The average weekly household earnings of single parents fell by £73 from February to April of this year, compared to a fall of £36 for the same period for households with children with more than one adult. And the TUC have released figures recently that in the 3 months to July, the number of redundancies of women have increased by a massive 79%, while redundancies of men increased by 23%. The result of all of this loss of income has meant that people have been forced to take action to mitigate the economic effects of the pandemic, whether that's through reducing their spending, using savings if they have any, borrowing money, applying for benefits, and approaching charities, including food banks, for help. The demand for food banks in Northern Ireland has soared because of COVID-19. In April, the number of emergency food parcels given out by the Trussell Trust in Northern Ireland rose 142% compared to the same period last year. So the pandemic has had a huge impact on the number of universal credit claims. On the 1st of March, there were 70,000 people claiming universal credit in Northern Ireland. And by the 26th of April, this number had risen by 80% to 126,000 claimants. And the latest figures show that monthly new claims to universal credit remain higher than normal, and these figures are likely to increase as the furlough scheme ends at the end of this month. So the pandemic has really highlighted the need for the social security system to act as a safety net for people in difficult times. It must provide sufficient support to the huge numbers of people, particularly women, who are going to be impacted by this crisis, both in terms of short-term income shocks, but also for those who are facing longer-term financial hardship. The Feminist Recovery Plan reinforces how crucial it is for women's well-being and for long-term economic recovery that the policy decisions made following the pandemic do not further impact on women. So any recovery must not be to the detriment of women like happened with the last recession. So the plan made a number of recommendations for change in relation to social security, which I'm just going to go through very briefly. So it recommended that the £20 per week increase to the standard allowance of universal credit and tax credits introduced to help with the pandemic is made permanent and also extended to households on legacy benefits. We recommended an increase to the level of child benefit to £50 per child per week to help poor families stay out of poverty and reflect the additional costs facing parents. We call for an increase to the discretionary support budget, removing the income ceiling for it and extending the eligibility criteria, and to make more payments as grants rather than loans. We asked for the continuation of the pause for deductions of benefit debts, and within that to include the recovery of advance payments through universal credit. We asked for an increase in the level of carers allowance and to consider a one-off coronavirus supplement of £20 per week to match the rise in universal credit, as was suggested by Carers UK. This would particularly benefit women who often provide higher levels of care. And I'm going to talk about the recommendations specific to universal credit that were made in the Feminist Recovery Plan a wee bit later, because it ties in with the findings from our Universal Credit and Women research paper. They both very much overlap. So just to talk then about the impact of universal credit on women, it has been argued that universal credit is discriminatory by design, as there are a number of key features of the benefit which disproportionately impact on women. And that includes the single payment, which has obvious issues in domestic violence situations and also implications for women's financial independence. The lack of a second earner work allowance in universal credit, so that provides no incentive for second earners, who are mostly women, to either enter or progress in work. Increased conditionality within universal credit, especially for lone parents, and issues with the way childcare is paid. So it's paid in universal credit, it's paid retrospectively, despite most childcare providers requiring upfront fees. So in our research, we spoke to women in disadvantaged and rural areas of Northern Ireland about their experiences with universal credit. And I'm just going to run through some of the key findings from that research, the Women's Regional Consortium research. So women, as you might imagine, had overwhelmingly negative experiences of universal credit, fraught with financial insecurity, debt, worry, and in some cases, cold and hunger. To quote one of the women, "With universal credit, it's no life to live. We can't have the heating on because we can't afford the gas. We have to use hot water bottles at night. Thank God for food banks. 32% of the women that we spoke to had applied for universal credit as a result of COVID. The rest for a number of other reasons, including the birth of a new child or a change of relationship status. Almost all of the women reported negative impacts due to the 5-week wait. 61% had borrowed from family or friends. 53% had had to cut back on food or essential items. 25% had had to borrow from a lender, and 18% had to sell possessions, with 16% having to use a food bank. As one of the women said, the 5-week wait was horrendous. I sold my sofa and had to borrow as well. The personal impacts of the 5-week wait were also severe, with 89% of the women reporting that they suffered from stress and anxiety. 51% reported getting into debt or further debt. 39% felt it had impacted on their children in a negative way, and 30% felt cold and hungry due to a lack of money. Of the women we spoke to, 58% had applied for an advance payment through Universal Credit, and those are loans basically taken on to help people through the 5-week wait. But 42% said that they were experiencing difficulties paying back their advance payment. 86% of the women had not heard about the help available through the Universal Credit Contingency Fund, and only 2 of the women had received help through it. So it makes non-repayable grants to Universal Credit claimants who are in hardship. So the help is there, but most of the women had not heard about it. So these findings led to a series of recommendations. Many of these, as I said, are in the Feminist Recovery Plan, and some of them replicate and support the Cliff Edge asks, which Kerry will talk about shortly. So we asked that government would apply an intersectional gender lens to social security policy, so that part of the solution should be to ensure that the benefit system, particularly universal credit, provides specific support to women who are likely to be impacted more by the crisis. As I said, we recommended that the increase to the standard allowance of universal credit introduced as a result of the pandemic is made permanent, but also to make a further £20 per week increase to the child element of universal credit to specifically support families with children. We called for an end to the 5-week wait, or at the very least, the conversion of advance payments to grants. And locally, the Department for Communities could consider automatic grants from the Universal Credit Contingency Fund for first-time claimants. We called on the department to do much more to inform claimants about the Universal Credit Contingency Fund and work to simplify the process for applying for that so that it doesn't put people off. We stated that the 2-child limit and benefit cap disproportionately impact on women and both apply to universal credit. We want to see an end to the 2-child limit. If not, then locally there could be a payment, an additional payment made through mitigations for those who are impacted. We also want to see the benefit cap mitigation extended to all new claimants. And I know both of these are also Cliff Edge asks, and Kerry will touch on these in more detail. We want to see childcare costs paid direct to providers, which was also a recommendation from the Work and Pensions Committee, to alleviate the problem of prohibitive upfront costs and help claimants with budgeting, plus give providers much needed certainty of income. And I just want to finish with a quote from the recently published report by the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee. They said, "The mechanics of universal credit do not reflect the reality of people's lives. It is designed around an idealised claimant, and rigid, inflexible features of the system are harming a range of vulnerable groups, including women, disabled people, and the most vulnerable." Thanks.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. It's really important that we do have this Northern Ireland specific research. And what keeps coming out of it time and time again is just that it is discriminatory against women. There is no willingness to even acknowledge that women are disproportionately impacted by these government decisions. And thank you again for providing an overview to everyone here. There is much more detail based on what Siobhan has presented in the Feminist Recovery Plan. And if you go onto the Women's Regional Consortium website, you'll see a whole range of research that she's done in the last number of years. So thank you. So next up, we have Kerry Logan from Housing Rights and Cliff Edge Coalition. And Kerry is going to give an overview of the campaign and how it works in relation to welfare reform, mitigation packages, and the future of the campaign.
Hi everyone, as Rachel said, my name's Kerry. I work at Housing Rights, and we, along with our colleagues at the Law Centre, co-convene the Cliff Edge Coalition. So on behalf of the coalition, just firstly to say thank you so much for the invite to come along to speak today and for your ongoing support for the campaign. Just to give a brief background of our work, the coalition came together back at the beginning of 2019 to campaign about the end of the welfare reform mitigations, which were due to end in March 2020. Our membership quickly grew to over 100 member organisations from a really diverse range of sectors, from advice to housing to mental health to disability, and of course a large number of women's organisations, which I think really highlights both the depth of concern and the range of vulnerable groups who are impacted by social security cuts, as well as the particularly harsh impact on women. I'm sure most of you will already be aware, but just to give a brief explanation of the welfare reform mitigations package. Back in 2015, the Northern Ireland Executive committed £585 million over 4 years to a mitigations package to protect people here in Northern Ireland from some of the harshest aspects of welfare reform. So, for example, people impacted by the bedroom tax and the benefit cap have been protected through an automatic welfare supplementary payment, which makes up any shortfall that they would otherwise be facing. In terms of the developments in our campaign work so far, earlier this year, we were really pleased that the Minister for Communities committed to extending those mitigation protections beyond March 2020. However, the legislation to do that hasn't yet been passed. So what has happened so far is that the existing mitigations have been extended through contingency arrangements, which at the moment are due to last up until the end of December. The Minister has announced that she has shared a draft bill with the Executive regarding the bedroom tax mitigations, and that she will be bringing forward new regulations to provide for the extension of the remaining mitigations. And actually, in her most recent announcement, we were really encouraged to hear that she also recognised the need to protect families impacted by the 2-child limit, which I'll chat about a little bit more in a moment. Now, whilst all of this is very welcome, as a coalition, we have ongoing concerns and really 2 key asks moving forward. Firstly, that the legislation to extend the existing mitigations is passed as soon as possible, and that it closes 2 loopholes that exist in the existing mitigations around the bedroom tax and the benefit cap, which again, I'll chat about in more detail in just a moment. Our second key ask is that a co-design review of the mitigations package, which again the Minister has committed to carrying out, is progressed as soon as possible in order to identify mechanisms in order to strengthen the mitigations package to address new challenges that people are facing that weren't in the original mitigations package, such as universal credit, including the 2-child limit, and cuts to housing benefits in the private rented sector. Firstly, just to look at those 2 loopholes that I mentioned in the existing mitigations legislation that we are calling for closing as soon as possible. In terms of the bedroom tax mitigations, under the existing arrangements, if you are impacted by the bedroom tax, so if you live in a social tenancy and you have more bedrooms than you're deemed to require, you will be impacted by the bedroom tax, but you'll receive an automatic welfare supplementary payment to make up the shortfall. However, if you move to another social tenancy in which you continue to have extra bedrooms, you'll lose that protection. So for example, if you are a single person living in a housing executive property and you have 2 bedrooms, you'll be protected through the benefit cap, the bedroom tax, mitigation payment. But if you move to another housing executive or housing association tenancy where you continue to have extra bedrooms, you'll lose that protection. By May of this year, over 300 households had lost their bedroom tax mitigation payment in that way. And in terms of the impact of that loss on households, the housing executive a couple of years ago looked into the impact on some of their tenants who had lost their bedroom tax mitigation payment, and they found that average arrears per household, so the amount of debt that those households were in terms of their rent, almost quadrupled in the 5 months that followed. So we're talking about a really significant impact on people's housing situation, and that's the first loophole that we are calling urgently to be closed in the legislation to extend these existing mitigation payments. The second loophole, and one that has a really significant impact on women, is the benefit cap loophole. So as you know, if you are a couple or a family with children, if the total amount of benefits that you receive exceeds £20,000 a year, you will be impacted by the benefit cap. However, under the mitigations package, if you're protected by the package, you'll receive an automatic welfare supplementary payment to make up any shortfall that you're facing. However, these benefit cap mitigations are only available to households who were in receipt of those benefits back in 2016, whenever the mitigations package was introduced. So if you are newly claiming benefits post 2016 and you are affected by the benefit cap, you will not receive a mitigation payment and you'll feel the full hit of the benefit cap on your household income. This has a particularly harsh impact on women. Indeed, the most recent statistics in May showed that all of those households affected by the benefit cap were families with children, and 77% were lone parents. And we know that 91% of lone parents are women. So we're talking about a particularly harsh impact on women in terms of this. In terms of the impact on families, those May statistics showed that the average loss per household is £200 per month. So we're talking about a really significant impact to household income. And actually in some cases, the impact is significantly more than that. At Housing Rights, we have been working with a family with 4 children who are facing a benefit cap that amounts to £800 per month. And we looked at what that meant for the household income of that family after housing costs. And it would leave them with an income that's 68% below the poverty line. So there are many families and many women being impacted by this loophole. And it's really crucial that loophole is closed as soon as possible and that people are protected from the benefit cap no matter when they start their claim. And it's even more urgent in light of the COVID crisis. We heard from Siobhan about the surge in people claiming universal credit as a result of COVID-related hardship. And that means that more and more people are going to be impacted by the benefit cap and not protected through these welfare supplementary payments. So it's really key that that legislation is passed and amended as soon as possible, as the longer these contingency arrangements are in place, the more and more people we are going to see falling through these loopholes. And we know that particularly with regard to the benefit cap loophole, that has a really significant impact on women in particular. The second stage in which we are calling for urgent action is in terms of strengthening the mitigations package. So as a coalition, we very much welcome the Minister's commitment earlier this year to review the mitigations package through a co-design process, and that's something we have been calling for as a coalition from the outset, in order to identify new mechanisms to protect people from additional challenges that they are facing as a result of welfare reform. And we are calling for that process to meaningfully involve people who are directly impacted by social security cuts, as well as organisations working to support them, in order to identify those mechanisms to address new challenges such as universal credit, particularly the 2-child limit, and to add extra support to low-income households who are impacted by social security cuts in the private rented sector. Siobhan has already given a really stark overview of the impact of universal credit on women, and we know that within that the two-child limit is obviously a particularly gendered issue as well. Under this policy, most families are unable to claim the child element of universal credit for third or additional children, which translates to an average loss of over £2,700 per year per child. And again, we're seeing the really harsh impact that has on women, as the vast majority of child tax credit payments are paid to a female parent. So again, it's women who are bearing the brunt of that loss. When it comes to strengthening the mitigations package to address universal credit, two-child limits, and these additional challenges that women are facing, ultimately our message as a coalition is that we can't afford not to. That was true before COVID, and the crisis has really shone a light on just how crucial it is that our social security system does what it says on the tin and provides people with security. I think there's a lot of truth in this idea that we may all be in the same storm, but we are by no means all in the same boat. And as we've been discussing this morning, social security cuts over the past decade have already had a particularly acute impact on women. And as is highlighted right throughout the Feminist Recovery Plan, so has the COVID crisis. So when it comes to economic justice for women at this time, it is crucial both that the legislation is urgently passed to close those loopholes in the current mitigations, and that the package is strengthened to address new challenges that women across the country are facing around the likes of universal credit and the two-child limit. And crucially, that women directly impacted by these social security cuts are involved in that review process, and we're listening to their voices right throughout. With all of the uncertainty and hardship that people are facing at this time, I would just like to end on a message of hope, as I think whenever the mitigations package was first introduced back in 2015, it was a clear signal that in Northern Ireland we were doing things differently. The opportunity now exists for our decision makers to build upon that. Over the past number of months, we have seen new ways of working together. We've seen that change can happen, and actually it can happen really quickly when it needs to. So it's our hope as a coalition that our decision makers here will grasp that opportunity to build upon the mitigations package and ensure that everybody, and women in particular, are protected and provided the crucial social security protection that they need at this time. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your ongoing support for our campaign and for all of your help in driving forward the asks of the coalition.
Thank you so much, Kerry. That was incredible, and a really useful overview of where we stand currently with welfare reform and how that has been worsened due to COVID. And one thing I found in my experience as lobbyist, when I bring these issues to different political parties, I have been met by some parties who don't even know that we have these caps in place. So for example, one party said to me, oh, we don't have a two-child cap, and sent me a link to a website. But if you read beyond the first line of that website, you would see we do. And I've also had different groups say to me, there's no such thing as a 5-week wait. Well, we know that that's not true either. And even if you look at the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who recently said that he didn't know what no recourse to public funds were, you know, refugees and asylum seekers groups that can't access any support at all. And Boris Johnson doesn't even know that that's a policy that his party has took in. It really shows the need for us to keep harping on about these issues and showing the gendered impact. And just before I move on to our final speaker, I wanted to just raise a few stats specific to disabled women that we pulled together recently. So as a group of women that are among the worst hit, so disabled women already earn 22.1% less than able-bodied men. 26% of households with disabled people in it live in poverty compared to 22% overall. And drastically through welfare reform, we've seen the change from disability living allowance to personal independence payment. There is an ongoing review at the minute, and I know Siobhan's working on that, but we already know that this has had a drastic impact on women. Women are the majority of claimants of disability benefits in Northern Ireland. And in general, because of welfare reform, disabled women lost 13% of their annual income. If it was a disabled single mother, they lost 21% of their annual income. And if it was a disabled single mother who also had a disabled child, they lost 32% of their annual income. So it just shows that the most marginalized groups of women in our society are being the worst hit by these decisions. And they're also the groups that are least likely to be involved in the decision-making process at all. So really important stuff that you've all covered so far today. And on that very stressful note, I will pass on to Rachel from the Law Centre Northern Ireland, who's just going to give us some a bit of an overview of the case studies that they've seen and how women have been worse impacted. So
that's lovely, Rachel. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the invitation to the Law Centre to come along and speak. Siobhan and Kerry, I don't know how I can follow up those, what you've said. I was agreeing with everything and then matching up several clients to every fact that you were saying. It truly is a really difficult time in the social security system, especially for women. Like Kerry, I tried to find some hope, a good news universal credit story. And I have one that I'm going to share because there was one. And it's part of sort of a broader issue. We have had a client who has had a very positive experience with universal credit. She was in receipt of contributions-based ESA, which is time limited, which means you can only receive it for 1 year. Came to the end of that 1 year period. She didn't qualify for income related ESA, but did make her application over to universal credit. She was really ready to move back into work, really wanted support to move back into work, and successfully transitioned back in. This did result in an improvement to her mental health because she did enjoy the structure of checking in with her work coach, of going back into a working environment, and she did enjoy the social interaction. So that is really good news and really, really positive. However, it's only one good news story of hundreds of really negative issues that I encounter in my job as an advisor. I suppose I should have started this off by saying that I'm the Welfare Reform Support Project Advisor within the Law Centre. I work in a team of 3. We specialise in the changes to the social security system, primarily PIP and universal credit. My particular focus and interest is on universal credit. So I'd be looking at that in a lot more detail. So naturally, we have seen an exceptionally high number of calls in relation to universal credit, but it has always been the case that our workload and our inquiries would be mostly from women. They do tend to take the responsibility for ensuring continuing finances for the household. They tend to be the ones that are contacted and seeking help. That's always been an ongoing trend, I certainly find. I do want to highlight a couple of case studies and that are relating particularly to the benefit cap. This is the issue that we've been working and seeing most lately. The first client I want to talk about is a lone parent. She's got 6 children, 2 of which have complex needs, and she's currently living in a private rented sector property. She's unable to work. She has mental health problems herself. But also she is providing childcare for 6 children, all aged under the age of 16. So her hands are definitely full. When she initially made her claim for universal credit in and around a year ago now, she was originally given a grace period. A grace period is a 9-month period where the benefit cap does not apply to you. And she qualified for this because her ex-partner's earnings were high enough. So she was actually forced to claim universal credit because her relationship broke down and she separated from her partner. And so that was what we like to call the trigger for her to make an application for universal credit. So she was protected from the benefit cap for the initial 9 months of her claim. But from May 2020, the benefit cap deduction began to apply. And I don't want to trump Kerry here, but this client is actually subject to a benefit cap deduction in excess of £1,000 a month. That is a phenomenal amount of money, and that is being reduced from her benefit. When you do the maths, she's left with £150 a week of universal credit to raise her 6 children herself and to provide the additional costs associated with raising disabled children. Some of the really concerning things that happened in relation to this case study was that this client was not given any warning that her benefit was about to be reduced by the benefit cap. So whilst at the point where she made her claim 9 months previously, she was told you'll only get this benefit cap, or you'll only be receiving this amount of money for 9 months. There wasn't a reminder sent out. So when she got her benefit payment that month, that was her first sort of recollection or first prompt, her first reminder that her benefits were going to be reduced by quite a significant amount. As a result of this, she's now in substantial rent arrears. We have been unable to get her financial support to buy uniforms for her children to return to school. We are struggling to get her supports in order to feed her children. She has been to the food bank for the maximum number of times that she can be to the food bank, and our ability to access community support for her is quickly drying up because she is reaching her maximum limit. There are a number of ways where clients can become exempt from the benefit cap and it will no longer apply, and we are actively supporting the client in all these routes. Unfortunately, they all involve having to be awarded another Social Security benefit, and decision making in relation to these benefits has all been significantly delayed due to COVID-19. So if we are able to get the limited capability for work-related activity element included in her award, then the benefit cap will no longer apply. Those assessments were paused due to COVID-19, have only recently restarted, and we're supporting the client through that process. It is likely, though, that that is going to end up at an appeal. Her claim for PIP for her own mental health problems was unsuccessful. We're supporting the client with their appeal in relation to that. But again, that has been significantly delayed due to COVID. Her 2 children that have complex needs, there's a much wider issue there. They would certainly meet the criteria for an award of child DLA. That would also make the household exempt from the benefit cap. However, we are experiencing a delay in getting a diagnosis for the children due to other waiting list restraints. The one child is currently 444 on the non-urgent referral list. The other child is at near 1,000, and she has been told don't bother ringing back for a year. So although you don't need a diagnosis in order to apply for DLA for a child, it does tend to significantly help and support an application. So we're now torn to what to do in relation to processing those applications. So it's a very difficult situation to be in. This client was also caught out by a loophole when it comes to accessing the benefit cap mitigation payment. So this, she was in receipt of the mitigation payment back in 2016. She was in receipt of housing benefit at that time and received housing benefit from September 2016 to January 2017 and was getting a mitigation payment paid for that claim. When her housing benefit closed in 2017, and then she didn't make an application until Universal Credit until about a year ago, that was considered to be a break in the claim. Because that would be her second time of needing to access a mitigation payment, her claim has been unsuccessful and she's not able to access that support. So she doesn't get any top payment. She is left with a £1,000 deficit per month that she has to try and make up. We have explored and we've put in an application for a discretionary housing payment, and we're waiting on the outcome of that decision to see if we can in any way support this client. The Department for Communities and Universal Credit have both suggested that the discretionary housing payment is the fund that we should apply for and it will make everything better, but we're just trying to wait and see. The problem is, in this case, there is no way for this client to make up that £1,000 difference. She can't go to work. It's just not possible for her. And if she were to go to work, her benefit cap might increase. She'd be claiming childcare costs. She would have income coming in. So she mightn't actually be any better off if she were to go. She'd need to be earning over it's £500. It's maybe a little bit more now per month in order to be exempt from the benefit cap. And that's going to be difficult for her to do while still get childcare costs. And as Siobhan had mentioned, there's a whole issue with childcare costs in itself. So at the minute, she's left with a £1,000 deficit, and we're trying to support her as best we can by accessing grants and by accessing funds. That's a really difficult case. Just before I came on this call, and I'll make this one quick, Rachel, because I know I've used up my time, but just before I came onto this webinar, I was on the phone with another one of my clients, and she was desperately upset. And she was actually upset as a result of an email that I had sent, which was explaining all the issues with her universal credit claim. These are never pleasant emails for me to send, but the client had approached us again with a benefit cap issue. She had queried whether the deduction for her benefit cap was correct on her claim. She is also a lone parent. She's got 4 children aged between 16 and 9. There are no illnesses and disabilities in this case, but the client is just unable to work at present. She had queried her benefit cap deduction and had supplied universal credit statements dating back 13 assessment periods, so a little over a year. I manually reviewed each of those calculations, and every single calculation was wrong. So this was a case where the wrong figures had been used by Universal Credit, the wrong income figures had been used, the wrong housing costs had been input. In one instance, there was a manual intervention by Universal Credit, and they had completely messed up the claim. And the client is now subject to a series of overpayments and underpayments that's going to take a significant amount of time to rectify. We have potentially got about a £2,000 fallout across the 13 months that we're going to have to try and make up. Again, this client's benefit cap hasn't been mitigated, but Universal Credit haven't given us a reason as to why it won't be mitigated. She has been in receipt of qualifying benefits for long enough. There doesn't seem to be a break in her claim. She should qualify for the mitigation payment, but Universal Credit are simply saying no. So this is a really difficult position to be in. She didn't experience any change of circumstances either that led to any changes in her award. She was simply reliant upon the Universal Credit computer system and was reliant upon the benefit rate changes in April, and that is what has caused all the problems in her case. This is particularly difficult as if an overpayment is raised against her, which it will be. Overpayments under Universal Credit are fully recoverable. There's no way to challenge or appeal it. So even if Universal Credit say it's all our fault, you as a client are still expected to pay it back. So it's a really difficult position to be in, and we're obviously going to be supporting that client as best we can to try and get some of that money written off. So not only are women impacted in terms of mainly being the main claimants for Universal Credit, they're victims of a really poorly designed computer system and a really poorly designed benefit in itself, where even if you do everything that you're supposed to and you have no obligations to report anything, it can all still go tragically wrong. And in this lady's case, the entire claim, not just one award, but her entire claim has been wrong from the start. And it's only that she queried the benefit cap. It's only that her friend actually told her that doesn't look right. And she came to us, did we realise that her whole entire claim had been wrong. Nobody within Universal Credit knew that. So again, really, really difficult position for the client to find herself in. I could talk for ages. I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It really is so useful to hear these stories of how these policy decisions actually impact people on an everyday basis. And I have had so many women come to me out of the blue, for example, being told, I owe £7,000 in housing benefit. How did this happen? Nothing has changed in my life. They've made a mistake and I have to find £7,000 to pay them. And whenever we questioned as well the wider executive about people having to pay back amounts that they owe, we were told, oh, but that's a maximum £40 a month they have to pay back. So they could be paying it back for years and years. But the cost of COVID is more than £40 a month, so people don't have this income. So I just wanted to go through some of the questions that we have so far. So thank you so much to all of our speakers. One of the questions that's come in from Tal is in relation to one of the case studies you just mentioned, Rachel. So it's how much will it cost to get a private diagnosis for her children, and is that even possible? And just before we go into that, I think it's worth noting that in Northern Ireland, you're 3,000 times more likely to wait over a year for a specialist appointment. and compared to the rest of the UK, our waiting lists have really got out of control for certain conditions. Immune system related conditions, you can wait up to 5 years to see a specialist, and that has started to filter into the private sector too. And a lot of specializations have just been halted right now during COVID and will continue to be for the foreseeable future in both public and private healthcare. Rachel, I don't know if you want to respond at all to that.
Yeah, so you can get private diagnosis. You're looking at a starting point of about £700 per child in order to get that diagnosis. So you'll have to try and find that money. It's really difficult to get grants to sort of support that, but we are looking and exploring to see if it would be possible to access some financial support. The problem is, evidentially, a private report isn't given the same rating as one from the NHS. So even if you pay that £700, for some reason, it may not be accepted by schools, it may not be accepted by benefit agencies. They prefer to have one from the NHS. So you can spend that money on that report and then not actually receive any benefit from it. It's a horrible situation to be caught in. And obviously £700, that's £1,400 for her children. There's no way at the minute she can afford that.
Thanks, Rachel. And there are issues as well with the fact that PIP is now run by Capita, private company. Lots of issues about how they assess medical evidence or even discount medical evidence or completely ignore medical evidence that is submitted. So we have quite a few questions here, so I'm gonna maybe group them. So I have one as well asking Kerry about how does the bedroom tax impact those in private rented property, not social housing?
So the bedroom tax, in terms of what we're talking about in terms of the mitigation payment, it's specific to social housing. So it, in effect, in terms of that mitigation payment, it's only for people who are living in social tenancies. But the way in which housing benefits are calculated in the private rented sector means that the bedroom tax has an effect been affecting people in private rented tenancies for the past decade as well, but it's just not defined as the bedroom tax. So there's been a range of cuts to housing benefit for people living in the private rented sector over the past decade. And that's one of the reasons why we are calling for a strengthened mitigation package to look at support that could be provided to low-income households in the private rented sector. It's a real area of concern for us at Housing Rights. We would always receive a disproportionate number of calls to our helpline from private renters. Around 18% of people in Northern Ireland live in the private rented sector. And at the onset of the COVID crisis, almost 3/4 of the COVID-related calls we were getting through to our helpline were from private renters, with affordability issues being chief among their concerns. So the bedroom tax mitigation payment in the package doesn't protect private renters. And one of our other concerns in terms of the private rented sector is for people living in social tenancies, there's a really effective infrastructure of support that social landlords provide to help people to navigate social security cuts. In the private rented sector, most private landlords in Northern Ireland only own 1 or 2 properties. They don't provide that wraparound support, and they're much less likely to be able and willing to withstand the arrears that come about because of social security cuts. So that's one of the areas in which we'd love to see the mitigation package strengthened.
Thank you, Kerry. So we have another few questions. One, this is a more generic question for everyone really. So it's from Rebecca, who says, I find it very interesting that the report shows that as a result of the pandemic, more people will use universal credit and the welfare system. Do you think this increased use of the welfare system might open up some opportunities to engage with government on the damaging impact of austerity measures?
I don't know if Rachel wants to take this after me, but just in general terms, that there are likely, as the person has said, there to be an increase in the number of universal credit claimants, and many of those are likely to have never had to claim benefits before, so they'll be new to the system and will be completely aghast at to what they have to go through in terms of particularly universal credit. So it will open up people's eyes to the flaws inherent within the design of universal credit, and that may result in increased discussions with policymakers, with government, because there'll be more people basically shouting louder. Now, it's unfortunate that it has to take that, or it may have to take that for changes to be made, but because there will be a new raft of people on there, then it may result in more focus being put on it.
Thanks, Siobhan. And I think it's worth noting as well, there can be a frustration in Northern Ireland where universal credit was designed by Westminster, but is a devolved matter for our Department of Communities. So sometimes when we're trying to lobby for changes, we can be told, well, the budget is allocated from Westminster, we've no control over how much money there is. But actually on a local level, they do have the power to introduce further mitigations, strengthen different provisions. So it's really for us trying to target the right groups. And this ties in nicely to another question on, are there any commitments to women in the previous programme for government or New Decade, New Approach? So New Decade, New Approach, the agreement that was signed in January after 3 years of a collapsed assembly, doesn't mention women once. There is zero reference to women in the entire agreement. I have been incredibly frustrated about this for quite a while. The only reference is that there will be a gender strategy, and the programme for social inclusion strategies the timetable was published earlier this week. So we hope that these strategies will lead to even the mention of women in the programme for government, but it's truly shocking that there are no commitments at present, not even when we look at women's involvement in paramilitaries, in debt, poverty, any of it, no reference at all. Caroline Smith has asked, why is there a maximum number of visits to a food bank?
Certain food banks can limit the number of times that you're able to access their service. And it's just about, I think, trying to make sure that they can help the maximum amount of people. And I know it is very regional. So the food bank local to me, it's 3 visits maximum. Maybe down in other parts of Belfast, it might be more. But just with this particular client, it is limited. So I think it's just a sort of an individual policy basis. It can also be to do with just available resources, and the amount of donations is going down. And we were seeing lots of calls from food banks to sort of increase provisions. So that would be the reason why. I don't think it's a particular, cap or anything like that that's across the province. It's just each particular food bank's approach.
Thank you, Rachel. And I do think it is very sad that even 5-6 years ago, there were no food banks at all in Northern Ireland. And now they're everywhere with a high number of people needing them. And we said earlier, 91% of lone parents are women in Northern Ireland, who are by far the biggest group that need to access food banks. So Caroline Rice has asked, there is a £500 isolation payment available in Britain. Why is this not in Northern Ireland? And I'll have to have this as the last question as we're finished up. Caroline, I had never heard of this payment at all before this question. But we do know that there are a number of changes or a number of differences in GB in relation to support packages and payments. So Rachel, I don't know if you want to come in on this at all.
Yeah, the range of financial supports is different, even if we're doing a direct comparison between the likes of universal credit. The available discretionary pots of money in GB are different to what we would have in Northern Ireland, and they've got different names and different criteria. It could just be it hasn't been announced here yet. We would have noticed comparatively, Northern Ireland was always a little bit behind when it was announcing its support packages. So it might just be that it's not been announced or it's not being considered here yet. But I think it's definitely one to keep looking at and keep focused on.
Thank you. And I definitely think it's something that we could look into and include in our recommendations if it's something that's possible. So I'm going to have to finish up there, but I really do think that was an incredibly informative hour hearing from our different speakers, and really just shows the reality of what's happening to women in Northern Ireland. These aren't a handful of cases, and these aren't the exception. These are the norm. This is what women are dealing with in Northern Ireland on a daily basis. We look at our child poverty rates in Northern Ireland. Child poverty doesn't exist without women's poverty too. So we need to have a very interrelated approach. In Northern Ireland, we need to have imaginative economic thinking beyond what we have now. And most importantly, we need to move beyond divisive politics and actually focus on helping people in Northern Ireland. So we will continue working on our recommendations in the Feminist Recovery Plan. We'll continue supporting the Cliff Edge Coalition, and we will continue trying to get as much of this information out there as possible. So that's it for today. I'm going to add this up onto our website and you'll be able to watch back and our future webinars too. But thank you so much to everyone. I'll send an email with all the links from the chat and the recording. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today.